The dust of redemption was the color of rust and regret. It settled on everything: the warped timbers of the saloon, the sun-bleached horse trough, and the shoulders of men who had nowhere else to be. For Jack, it was simply a place to trade a necessary intrusion on the solitude he had cultivated in the high country. He had been alone for months, trapping beaver and marten, the silence of the mountains his only companion. Now the clatter of wagons and the murmur of voices felt alien, a language he had nearly forgotten. He tied his pack horse to the rail outside the general store, its panniers heavy with prime winter pelts. In his pocket, his fingers found the cool, familiar shape of a silver locket. He drew it out, its surface worn smooth by his thumb. Inside, behind a small, hinged frame, was a miniature portrait, faded but still clear. A woman with eyes as dark and kind as a forest pool, and a small boy with a laugh that could make wildflowers grow. His wife. His son. The locket was all he had left of them. A ghost he carried close to his heart. He was negotiating a price for his furs with the storekeeper, a man whose face was a roadmap of weary compromises, when the afternoon calm shattered. A gunshot cracked through the air, sharp and final. Women screamed, men scattered for cover. The double doors of the Redemption Bank and Trust burst open, and 3 masked men spilled out onto the street, burlap sacks slung over their shoulders. 2 of them fanned out rifles leveled at the cowering townsfolk. The third, their leader, moved with a different kind of energy, not the frantic rush of a common thief, but the coiled grace of a predator. He was tall, dressed in a long black duster, and the silver conchos on his gun belt gleamed in the harsh sunlight. He paused, scanning the street, his eyes behind the bandana, seeming to find a grim amusement in the chaos. Jack flattened himself against the storefront, his hand instinctively going to the hunting knife at his belt. It was a fool's weapon against rifles, but his body remembered the instinct to fight, even if his spirit had forgotten how. The leader's gaze swept past him, then snapped back, locking onto the silver locket still clutched in Jack's hand. With 3 fluid strides, the outlaw was in front of him. He was close enough for Jack to see the cold fire in his eyes, to smell the faint, unusual scent of expensive cigarillo smoke clinging to his clothes. Well, now the man's voice was a low, charismatic purr that cut through the surrounding panic. What have we here? He didn't reach for Jack's coin purse. He reached for the locket. Jack's hand closed around it, a reflexive, desperate clench. The outlaw's smile was visible even beneath the bandana. Let it go, friend. A man shouldn't carry his ghosts so close to his heart. The words, so strangely intimate and cruel, struck Jack harder than a fist. He didn't let go. For a moment that stretched into an eternity. Their eyes met in a silent battle of wills over the last remnant of Jack's shattered world. The outlaw's amusement faded, replaced by a flash of icy irritation. With a contemptuous flick of his wrist, he brought the barrel of his pistol down hard across Jack's temple. Light exploded behind Jack's eyes. The strength fled his limbs, his fingers going slack. The locket was snatched from his grasp. He staggered back, a warm wetness trickling down his face, the world tilting and blurring. The last thing he saw before the dusty boardwalk rose to meet him was the outlaw turning away, casually slipping the silver locket into his duster pocket as if it were a trifle, a mere bauble from a day's violent work. Then darkness claimed him as the gang mounted up and galloped out of town, leaving behind nothing but terror dust and a silence that felt deeper and more profound than the one Jack had known in the mountains. Snow fell that winter as if the sky had no other purpose. It fell in thick, silent sheets that promised to bury the world, to cover the trails, the fields, and the wide canyons that usually showed their red bones through the season. The wind moaned through skeletal cottonwoods, a lonely song of survival. It was in this bitter season, when most men stayed close to their hearths, that Jack's world, already broken, threatened to dissolve completely. He stumbled through the biting wind, a ghost himself, half blinded by the swirling flakes. The wound on his temple was a raw, throbbing ache, but it was nothing compared to the hollow cavern where the locket used to be. After the outlaws had gone, the people of redemption had offered him little more than pitying glances. He was just another victim, a nameless trapper caught in the crossfire. He'd used the money from his pelts to buy a horse and supplies, driven by a single burning purpose: to find the man who had stolen the last image of his family. But the trail had gone cold in the foothills, and now the storm had come erasing everything. He was lost. The gash along his ribs, a souvenir from the rock slide that had followed his family's murder, had reopened in the fall. It bled sluggishly through his coat, a steady, chilling drain on his remaining strength. He chewed on pine bark, drank melted snow from his cupped hands, and pressed his palm to his side, a futile effort to hold the warmth in. Wolves trailed him, once their yellow eyes glimmering like embers in the gathering dark, but they turned away, sensing he was nearly carrion already. His thoughts swam between memory and fever. He saw his boy's laughter in the summer grass, heard his wife singing softly as she ground corn. He remembered the snap of the wagon wheel, a sound as sharp as a rifle shot. He saw his brothers Thomas and Noan, their faces unreadable as they watched him leave for the winter gathering. His father, the great Apache chief, had chosen him as his successor, not the eldest Thomas nor the cunning Noan, but Jack, the quiet one with steady hands and eyes that saw beyond anger. That choice had planted jealousy like a poison thorn in his brothers' hearts. They had slipped away that day, their knives working silently on the spokes of the wagon wheel. He turned just in time to see the cart tilt, his wife's eyes wide with terror. He shouted her name, but the snow swallowed his voice. Wood splintered. The wagon toppled over the edge of the ravine, her hand reaching for him before vanishing into a maelstrom of white and shadow. He had scrambled down the slope, his legs bleeding from the sharp rocks, and found them at the bottom. His wife so still, his child broken. He had dug their grave with bare hands until his fingers split and bled, whispering the words of his people. A prayer for spirits lost too soon. His tears had frozen on his cheeks. Now that same unforgiving snow sought to claim him. On the fourth day of his wandering, his strength finally broke. He staggered down a ridge into a shallow valley where a fence line stretched through the drifts. The posts were rough-hewn, leaning with the weight of winter, but they marked something: land that was claimed, tended, fought for. He saw a small house in the distance, a thread of smoke curling from its chimney like a prayer. He tried to call out, but his voice was only a frozen whisper lost to the wind. He took 2 more steps. Then his knees gave way. The snow rose around him, soft and merciless. Darkness swept in like a tide. Mary Mallister was not expecting visitors. Life had carved its lessons into her face, leaving lines of endurance where smiles might have been. Her husband's death had left her with a small, struggling farm, 2 children, and debts that loomed larger than the San Juan peaks. Her farm was a patch of stubborn life, carved out of an unforgiving landscape, her cabin sagging like a tired old man, its fence line fighting a losing battle against the encroaching wilderness. Yet she managed by will and by habit, one day folding into the next. Her boy Caleb, 10 years old and already burdened with the gravity of a grown man, was the one who saw the figure in the snow. He'd been checking traps, a small hatchet on his belt, as if to prove he was the man of the house now. He came running, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his eyes wide. "Mama, there's someone out by the posts." Mary set down the milk pail she was carrying, pulling her thin shawl tighter. "What do you mean, someone?" "A man. He's down. Might be dead." For a heartbeat, she considered leaving him. Trouble was a luxury she could not afford. But her daughter Emma, 5 years old, with eyes that held the wisdom of the hills, tugged at her skirt. "We can't leave him, Mama," she said in her small, clear voice. "He'll freeze." And that was that. Mary could no more ignore a soul freezing in the snow than she could ignore her own children's hunger. She grabbed a rope and followed Caleb through the deep drifts. They found him face down, half covered in white, his dark hair stiff with ice, his coat torn and soaked with blood. Mary knelt, her gloved hand pressing against his neck. A faint, thready pulse beat beneath the cold skin. He was alive. Barely. "Help me turn him," she told Caleb. Together, they rolled the stranger onto the sled they used for firewood. He groaned a low, guttural sound of pain, then stilled again. His face was strong-boned, his features unmistakably Apache. A knot of fear tightened in Mary's stomach. Neighbors whispered of raids in the high country. To harbor such a man could bring ruin. But to leave him to die was a sin her conscience would not bear. They dragged him back to the cabin, a grueling step-by-step retreat from the storm. Emma held the door open, her eyes as round as silver dollars. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and boiled beans. They laid him on a cot near the stove, the only real warmth they had to give. Mary cut away the frozen cloth from his side. The wound was ugly and deep, poorly bound and freshly torn. She worked quickly, her movements efficient, and practiced boiling water and steeping the few herbs she had left. She tore one of her last clean sheets into strips, pressing them hard against the gash. He flinched in his unconscious state, his breath hitching, but he did not wake. Caleb stood back, his arms crossed, a mask of suspicion on his young face. Emma knelt near the cot, watching with solemn curiosity. "Is he going to die, Mama?" she whispered. Mary didn't answer. She only kept working her jaw tight as the storm outside rattled the shutters, and the man on the cot lay suspended between life and death. Weeks later, the world outside was still white. But inside the cabin, a fragile peace had settled. Jack had not died. He had clung to life with a silent, grim tenacity that Mary recognized in herself. Now his strength was returning in slow, measured increments. The fever had broken, leaving his blue eyes startlingly clear against his dark skin. He spoke little, his words spare and chosen with care, but his presence filled the small cabin. He was mending a broken hinge on the cupboard door when the sound of hoofbeats cut across the valley. It wasn't the sound of a lone rider, but several moving with purpose. Mary stiffened, wiping her hands on her apron as she moved to the window. 3 men were approaching, dressed in town coats and hats that looked out of place against the raw wilderness. The lead rider was a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache and eyes that held the flat, predatory gleam of a coyote. Jack moved to stand behind her, a silent shadow. He didn't recognize the men, but he recognized the type. They were vultures circling. Mrs. Mallister, the leader, called out, reining in his horse. He dismounted with an air of practiced authority. "Name's Harland, representing the Denver Pacific Railroad. I reckon you know why I'm here." Mary's stomach sank. "I do." Harland's gaze flickered past her to Jack, narrowing with professional appraisal. "This your hired hand?" "He's no concern of yours." Mary said, her voice sharper than she intended. Harland offered a thin, humorless smile. "Maybe not. But this land is. The railroad needs a clear line through this valley. Your late husband signed papers, took a loan against this property for expansion. An expansion that never happened." He pulled a sheaf of documents from his coat. "The bank has sold the debt. To us. This is a foreclosure notice. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." 30 days, in the middle of winter, the words were a plea, and she hated the weakness in them. "The march of progress." Mrs. Mallister Harland said, his voice laced with a slick, dismissive politeness. is a costly business. Your husband understood that, though perhaps not well enough. He handed the papers to her, his fingers brushing hers. At the same time, his eyes locked onto Jack, a flicker of something dark passing through them. A predatory interest. As Harlan spoke, Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. There was something familiar about the man's voice, that low, charismatic purr. And the scent. Faint but unmistakable. The same expensive cigarillo smoke from the bank in Redemption. His blood ran cold. He looked closer at the man's hands, at the shape of his jaw beneath the mustache. It couldn't be. But it was. The leader of the gang. The man who had stolen his locket. Silas Kane. Posing as a railroad agent? Jack's hand tightened into a fist at his side. He wanted to lunge to tear the truth from the man's throat. But he was still weak, his ribs a cage of fire. To act now would be suicide. He forced himself to remain still, his face a mask of stone. Harlan seemed to sense the shift in tension. He gave Jack another long, searching look, a slight smile playing on his lips as if he enjoyed the silent challenge. "You take care, Mrs. Mallister," he said, turning to remount his horse. "Progress waits for no one." As he rode away, Emma, who had been hiding behind her mother's skirts, whispered, "The bad man's eyes, don't smile, Mama." Mary pulled her children close, the foreclosure notice crinkling in her hand. She felt the weight of impending ruin settle upon her. But Jack felt something else. He was no longer just a man adrift. He was a man with an enemy who had not only stolen his past, but was now threatening to steal the fragile future he had stumbled into. The fight was no longer just for a memory in a silver locket. It was for this patch of stubborn life, this sagging cabin, and the family within it. That night, after the children were asleep, Mary sat staring into the fire, the papers lying on the table like a death sentence. "It's my debt," she said to the silence, "my burden." Jack, who had been sharpening Caleb's hatchet by the hearth, finally spoke, his voice low and guttural. "His name is not Harlan. It's Silas Kane." Mary turned, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "The man from the railroad. He's an outlaw. He led a bank robbery in Redemption. He's the one who gave me this." Jack touched the fading scar on his temple. "This isn't about a railroad. It's about something else." A new, sharper fear pierced through Mary's despair. What could he possibly want with this worthless piece of land? "I don't know." Jack admitted, the edge of the hatchet gleaming in the firelight. "But I'm going to find out." He looked at her, his blue eyes holding an intensity that made her breath catch. "A burden shared is lighter." She shook her head, a gesture of both denial and exhaustion. "You don't know what it means to fight men like that." A shadow passed over Jack's face, a darkness that seemed to swallow the fire's glow. "I know what it means to fight brothers." He said nothing more, but in the heavy silence that followed, Mary understood. This quiet, wounded man was no stranger to betrayal. And for the first time since Silas Kane had ridden up to her door, she felt a flicker not of hope, but of something far more dangerous: defiance. The first obstacle was money. The foreclosure notice was legal, and defiance alone wouldn't stop the law from riding into their valley. Mary and Jack spent a long night poring over the farm's meager accounts by candlelight. The answer was bleak. There was no money. "There's a bounty," Caleb said the next morning, his voice quiet but firm. He'd been listening from his cot, pretending to be asleep. "On the mountain lion, up in Black Creek Canyon. Been killing livestock over at the Miller place. $50. It was enough to hire a lawyer to file an injunction to buy them time. But Black Creek Canyon was treacherous territory, and Jack was still mending. "It's too dangerous," Mary said immediately. It's the only way. Jack countered, his eyes meeting Caleb's in a moment of shared grim understanding. "I know that canyon. I've tracked predators there since I was a boy." He was using the skills his Apache heritage had given him, skills he had once thought he'd never use again for the benefit of settlers. The irony was not lost on him. He set out at dawn 2 days later with a rifle, a bedroll, and a quiet promise to Mary. "I'll be careful." As he rode, he was not just a hunter. He was an investigator. Silas Kane was after this land for a reason, and it wasn't for a railroad. The valley was too remote, the terrain too rugged for tracks. There had to be something else. For 2 days, he tracked the mountain lion, its massive prints, a clear story in the thinning snow. But his eyes were searching for other signs. On the 3rd day, he found them. Near one of the survey stakes Silas's men had hammered into the frozen earth, he discovered the tracks of shod horses. These weren't the worn, mismatched shoes of local ranchers' ponies. They were new uniform, the mark of a well-funded outfit. And nearby, half buried in the snow, he found a discarded cigarillo butt. He picked it up. The paper was finer than any local brand, the scent of the tobacco rich and distinct. It was the same smell that had clung to Silas Kane. He was close to something. He could feel it. He sent a message with a traveling fur trader he encountered on the trail, a simple query for his tribe, asking if his brothers Thomas and Noan had been seen, if they were well. It was a test. He needed to know if the silence from his people was one of grief or something more sinister. He found the lion's den later that day, a narrow cave tucked into a rock face. The beast was magnificent, a ripple of muscle and tawny fur, but its eyes held the desperation of hunger. The fight was short, brutal, and necessary. Jack felt a pang of regret as he stood over the great cat, its lifeblood staining the snow. It had only been trying to survive, just like him. He returned to the farm with the bounty, the $50, a small but significant victory. The money gave them breathing room, a sliver of hope. But Jack's discovery of the tracks and the cigarillo had planted a seed of deeper unease. This was a calculated operation, not a simple land grab. Silas, sensing Jack's renewed resolve, decided to escalate. A few nights later, they awoke to the frantic barking of their dog. Jack was outside in an instant, rifle in hand. Lying on the porch, its throat slit, was a dead coyote. Its glassy eyes stared up at the moon, a clear and brutal warning. Caleb came out behind him, his face pale but his small hands clenched. Emma began to cry from inside the cabin. Mary appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of fury and fear. "He's trying to scare us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's telling me he knows I'm watching." Jack corrected his voice, dangerously low. He knelt, examining the clean cut on the animal's neck. This was a message meant for him, a hunter's warning to another. The lines were drawn. The intimidation pushed Mary's fear aside, replacing it with a hard, cold anger. She would not be driven from her home. For Jack, the dead coyote was a confirmation. Silas Kane was not just a ghost from his recent past and redemption. He was a phantom with a purpose, and that purpose was centered squarely on this small, isolated farm. The question that haunted Jack, that kept him awake long after the coyote's body had been dragged away and buried, was brutally simple: why? The answer, he knew, lay somewhere in the darkness, with Silas Kane, and Jack would have to walk into that darkness to find it. His opportunity came a week later. The response from the tribe arrived via the same trader, and it was just as Jack had feared, strangely delayed and evasive. It spoke of his brother's grief and their new responsibilities, but the words felt hollow, rehearsed. His suspicion that his brothers were somehow involved grew into a cold certainty. That same afternoon, he saw one of Silas's men ride toward the old abandoned mission at the far end of the valley. A meeting. He waited for nightfall. He moved through the trees like a wraith, his footsteps silent on the damp earth. The old mission church was a crumbling adobe ruin, its bell tower a jagged silhouette against a sky full of stars. Light flickered from a broken window. Jack crept closer, staying deep in the shadows, his heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. He could hear voices from within. Silas Kane's smooth, confident tone and the rougher replies of his men. They were talking about shipment schedules, blasting powder, and timetables. It made no sense. Then Silas said something that made the blood freeze in Jack's veins. He was giving an order to one of his men, a man who was clearly of Apache descent. And he spoke to him in a phrase from Jack's own tribe. An old specific phrase one used to describe a blood oath. It was impossible. A white settler speaking a dialect that only a handful of families in his tribe still used. Jack's mind raced, scrambling through the tattered fragments of his memory, searching for a face, a name. And then it hit him with the force of a physical blow. A story from his childhood. A raid years ago led by a band of renegade warriors not sanctioned by his father, the chief. They had attacked a small, isolated homestead on the edge of tribal lands. A family of settlers had been killed. All of them except for a young boy who had been away, who had returned to find his home in ashes and his family gone. The boy's name had been Silas. Silas Kane. Not Cain. Kane. His father had been devastated not just by the tragedy, but by his inability to stop the renegades. He had preached peace, but the actions of a few violent men had stained them all. Jack remembered his father trying to make amends, offering restitution to the boy. But the boy had vanished, consumed by grief and a burning hatred. Silas Kane was an alias. The man inside that church was the boy from that raid. And he didn't just blame the renegades. He blamed the chief who couldn't control them. He blamed Jack's father. Suddenly, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The land grab wasn't for the railroad. It was for revenge. This valley, this specific piece of land, must have some significance to Silas's past. And Jack. Jack was not some random trapper Silas had robbed. He was the son of the man Silas held responsible for the destruction of his world. The theft of the locket. It wasn't a random act of greed. It was a deliberate desecration. Silas had recognized him in redemption, had known exactly who he was. He was systematically destroying Jack's life, just as he believed Jack's father had destroyed his. The fight was no longer about a farm or even a stolen memento. It was about a blood debt decades old that had finally come due in this desolate valley. The world under Jack's feet had just shifted, revealing a chasm of hatred so deep it threatened to swallow them all. Jack returned to the cabin under the cloak of a starless night, the truth a cold, heavy stone in his gut. He found Mary waiting up for him, a rifle resting across her lap. She looked up as he entered her eyes, asking the question her lips did not. "It's revenge," Jack said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He explained everything the raid the boy named Silas Kane, the Apache phrase. He told her how this entire ordeal from the locket to the foreclosure was a calculated act of vengeance aimed at him, the son of the chief Silas, blamed for his family's murder. Mary listened, her face growing paler with each word. The conflict had transformed from a legal battle into a personal war. They were no longer fighting a corporation. They were fighting a man's obsession, a man for whom cruelty was a form of justice. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We fight," Jack said, "but not his way. We need proof. Something to take to the law in Durango that proves Harland is a fraud, and this foreclosure is illegal. Their plan was desperate. Jack would ride to the old county records office in Silverton, a 2-day journey to search for the original deed to Silas's family homestead. If he could prove Silas's connection to this valley, it would expose the entire railroad scheme as a sham. But just as he was preparing to leave, 2 riders appeared on the horizon. Jack's hand went to his knife, his body tensing. But as they drew closer, he recognized them. His heart lurched with a complicated mix of shock relief and deep-seated suspicion. It was his brothers, Thomas and Noan. They reined in their horses, their faces a carefully constructed mask of concern. Brother Tomas said, dismounting. His voice was heavy with false solemnity. "We received your message. We feared you were dead. When we heard from the trader that you were alive, we came at once." Noah nodded, his eyes avoiding Jack's. "We came to bring you home. Father is old. The tribe needs its leader. You must reclaim your birthright." Mary stood on the porch with Caleb and Emma, watching the reunion with wary eyes. The arrival of Jack's family should have been a comfort, but the timing felt too convenient, too perfect. A powerful dilemma seized Jack. Return to the family that had betrayed him, the life he had rejected, or stay with this new family. He had found a family now in mortal danger because of him. "My place is here now," Jack said, his voice steady. Thomas's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Here, with her, what on a patch of dirt? You are the son of a chief. Your destiny is with your people, not hiding on a settler's farm." "This is my home," Jack said, the words feeling truer than any claim to land or title he had ever known. That night, the cabin felt smaller, the air thick with unspoken tensions. Thomas and Noan spoke of tribal matters, of the need for Jack's leadership to protect their lands from encroaching settlers, the very settlers Silas pretended to represent. The hypocrisy was suffocating. Jack watched them, searching for a flicker of remorse, of truth, but found nothing but practiced deception. The true purpose of their visit was revealed in the dead of night. Jack, unable to sleep, slipped out of the cabin to check on the horses. He heard whispers coming from the barn. He crept closer, his heart turning to ice. It was Thomas and Noan, and they were not alone. A third man was with them, his silhouette unmistakable in the moonlight. "Silas Kane." "He refuses to leave," Thomas was saying, his voice a low hiss. "He's chosen this woman over his own blood." "Patience," Thomas Silas's smooth voice replied. "His attachment is his weakness. It makes him predictable. You've done your part. You've shown him that his old life wants him back. When he feels the walls closing in, when he feels truly alone, he will break." "What did you promise us?" Noan asked, his voice wavering with greed and fear. "What I always promise," Silas said, with a chilling finality. "Power. When Jack is gone, the tribe will look to you, Thomas. I will ensure the American government recognizes you as the sole chief. You will control the lands, the treaties, everything. All you have to do is help me make your brother disappear. Permanently." The betrayal was absolute. His brothers hadn't come to bring him home. They had come to deliver him to his executioner. They had sold him his birthright and the memory of his wife and son for a promise from the very man who embodied the hatred that had plagued their people for generations. Jack backed away into the shadows, a silent scream trapped in his throat. He was utterly, completely alone. His past was a web of lies spun by his own blood, and his presence here was a death sentence for the only people who had ever shown him true kindness. The second obstacle had fallen into place, a wall of betrayal that isolated him completely, leaving him vulnerable and cornered. The time for investigation was over. This would end in blood. The sandstorm hit without warning, a furious, blinding wall of ochre dust that swept through the valley and clawed at the sky. It turned the late afternoon into a suffocating twilight, and the wind howling like a legion of grieving spirits. It was the perfect cover for a final desperate confrontation. A message had arrived that morning, delivered by a boy from a neighboring farm, a single scorched piece of paper bearing a crude drawing of a silver locket. And beneath it, 2 words: the mission. Silas had Mary and the children. The abandoned mission church stood on the edge of the valley, a skeletal ruin against the raging storm. As Jack approached, the wind tore at his clothes, forcing grit into his eyes and mouth. A loose bell in the crumbling tower tolled erratically, a frantic, dissonant clang that served as a soundtrack for his dread. He tethered his horse in a gully and moved forward on foot, his rifle held tight against his chest. He slipped inside through a collapsed section of the rear wall. The interior was a maelstrom of dust and shadow. Wind screamed through the broken stained glass windows, kicking up eddies of sand that danced in the ghostly light. At the far end, near the desecrated altar, Silas Kane stood with Mary, Caleb, and Emma. A pistol was pressed against Mary's temple. Her face was pale but defiant. Caleb stood rigid, his small hands clenched into fists, trying to shield his sister who clung to his leg, her face buried in his trousers. "I knew you'd come," Silas called out over the howl of the wind, his voice calm and clear. "A man will always run toward the ghosts he thinks he can save." Jack stepped out from behind a pillar, his rifle leveled. "Let them go, Kane. This is between you and me." Silas laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Oh, it has always been between you and me, son of the chief. It started the day your father's renegades burned my world to the ground. He preached peace while my family burned. While my mother and sisters—" He choked on the words, his composure cracking for just a moment, revealing the raw, unhealed wound beneath. "Now you build a new family on land stained with my grief. This land was ours, my father's. I'm here to balance the ledger." "My father didn't lead that raid," Jack said, his voice raw. "He grieved with you. His grief was worthless." Silas roared, the sound swallowed by a gust of wind that sent the bell clanging wildly overhead. He offered apologies when he should have offered justice. "Your people took my family. Now I will take yours." As the word "yours" echoed in the chaotic space, 2 figures emerged from the shadows near the altar. Thomas and Noan. Jack's rifle wavered. "He offered us what was rightfully ours," Thomas declared, his face a mask of cold ambition. "You were always weak, brother. Too willing to see the other side. There is no other side. There is only power, and who is strong enough to hold it?" The double betrayal was a physical blow, sucking the air from Jack's lungs. He was surrounded, his new family held hostage, his old family aligned with his mortal enemy. He was at his breaking point. "You see," Jack Silas purred, savoring the moment. "Everyone chooses a side. Your brothers chose the future. You chose a grave." He shoved Mary toward Thomas, who grabbed her arms roughly. "Kill him," Silas ordered. But in that instant, Caleb moved. With a cry of pure rage, he launched himself at Silas's legs, sinking his teeth into the man's thigh. Silas yelled in pain and surprise, his pistol arm dropping. It was the only opening Jack would get. He fired. Not at Silas, but at the rope holding the mission bell. The rifle crack was deafening. The frayed rope snapped. With a groaning shriek of tortured metal, the massive bronze bell plummeted from the tower, crashing through the rotted roof timbers directly above the altar. Chaos erupted. The bell struck the floor with the force of a meteor shattering stone and sending a massive cloud of dust and splintered wood into the air. In the sudden, blinding confusion, Jack dove forward. He slammed into Noan, sending him sprawling, and wrenched the rifle from his grasp. He saw Mary break free from Tomas's grip, grabbing her children and pulling them behind the relative safety of a stone baptismal font. Tomas raised his pistol, his face contorted with fury, but Jack was faster. He fired the second rifle, the shot echoing like thunder. Tomas cried out and fell, clutching a leg shattered at the knee. Through the swirling dust, Jack saw Silas recovering, raising his pistol. There was no time to reload. Jack threw his empty rifle like a spear, catching Silas in the chest and knocking him off balance. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, drawing his hunting knife. The fight was primal, a desperate struggle in the choking dust and screaming wind. Silas was strong, fueled by decades of hatred, but Jack was fighting for something more than vengeance. He was fighting for life, for a future. They crashed against a pillar, Silas's fingers closing around Jack's throat, squeezing the air from his lungs. Jack's vision began to tunnel, black spots dancing before his eyes. With his last ounce of strength, he drove the knife upward deep into Silas's side. Silas gasped, his grip loosening. His eyes, wide with shock, met Jack's. In them, Jack saw not a monster, but the ghost of a broken boy who had never found his way home. The ledger. Silas whispered, a trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. He slid down the pillar, his pistol clattering to the floor. The locket fell from his coat, landing in the dust between them. Silence descended, broken only by the moaning of the wind and the pained whimpers of Tomas. Noan had vanished, fleeing into the storm like the coward he was. Jack staggered over to Mary and the children. He knelt, pulling them into an embrace that was fierce and protective. He was bruised, bleeding, and utterly exhausted, but he was alive. They were alive. He picked up the silver locket from the floor, its surface caked with the dust of the old church. He held it tight in his fist, a broken piece of his past that had, against all odds, led him to his future. In the storm's aftermath, a profound quiet settled over the valley. The sky was washed clean, and the air smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. The law from Durango arrived, guided by the fur trader Jack had spoken to, and took a wounded, venomous Tomas into custody. There was no sign of Noan. Like a shadow, he had dissolved back into the wilderness. Silas Kane, or rather, Silas Kane, was buried in an unmarked grave behind the ruined mission, his story a bitter postscript in the valley's history. The immediate danger was over, but the emotional wounds remained. In the days that followed, a new kind of silence filled the cabin, not one of tension, but of healing. Jack moved with a quiet purpose, his body aching, but his spirit settling. He saw the change most clearly in Caleb. The boy who had once looked at him with such deep suspicion now watched him with a quiet, respectful awe. One evening, as Jack sat on the porch steps cleaning his rifle, Caleb approached him. He said nothing but held out his small hatchet, offering it handle first. Jack paused, looking from the hatchet to the boy's serious face. It was more than a tool. It was a symbol of the trust Caleb had guarded so fiercely. It was an acceptance. Jack took it, his fingers brushing the boy's. He tested the edge with his thumb, then handed it back. "A good blade needs a good hand to guide it," Jack said softly. "You've got one." Caleb's chin lifted almost imperceptibly. He took the hatchet and returned to his chores, but a bridge had been crossed. He no longer saw Jack as a stranger who had invaded his home, but as a protector who had defended it. A week later, Jack took a long ride alone. He followed the winding trail up into the high country to the snow-fed creek and the narrow ravine. He stood before the simple pile of stones that marked the grave of his wife and son. The world was greening now, small alpine flowers pushing up through the soil. He opened the silver locket and looked at their faces one last time. He didn't say goodbye. He spoke to them, his voice low, carried on the mountain breeze. He told them about Mary and Caleb and Emma. He told them about the fight and the rage and the strange, quiet peace that had followed. He wasn't leaving them behind, he explained, but carrying their memory forward into a new life. He pulled the turquoise pendant his father had given him from around his neck. It was a symbol of his past, of the chiefdom he was meant to inherit. He laid it gently on the stones, the bright blue a stark contrast to the gray rock. He was letting go of the mantle of the leader he was supposed to become the man he needed to be. He closed the locket, slipped it into his pocket, and turned his horse back toward the valley, a sense of earned peace settling in his soul. He was riding home. Months later, the foreclosure threat was a distant memory, the fraudulent papers burned to ash in Mary's stove. The farm was beginning to thrive. The fence line was mended and strong, the garden overflowed with beans and corn, and the cabin which had once sagged like a tired old man now seemed to stand a little straighter. There was no formal wedding, no preacher summoned from town. Instead, on a warm autumn evening, as the setting sun painted the peaks in hues of gold and rose, they held a simple ceremony on the porch. Mary wore her best dress, and Jack wore a clean shirt. Emma had woven wildflowers into her hair, and Caleb stood beside Jack, his posture straight and proud. They exchanged vows, not of flowery promise, but of simple, profound truth, to stand together, to build together, to be a family. The final scene of their union was not the quiet kiss they shared, but what came after. As dusk settled, bathing the valley in a soft purple light, the four of them went out into the yard. Jack carried a small cottonwood sapling he had carefully dug up from the riverbank. Together, they dug a hole in the rich earth. Mary held the young tree steady while Jack and Caleb packed the soil around its delicate roots. Emma, with solemn importance, poured the first bucket of water. As they stood back to admire their work, the sapling a thin, hopeful silhouette against the twilight sky, Jack placed his hands on the children's shoulders. "A tree grows where it's planted," he said, his voice imbued with a quiet certainty. Mary took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. "It honors the ground it came from, but its branches reach for a new sky." A profound, earned sense of peace settled over them. It was a peace born not from the absence of storms, but from the strength to withstand them. They were four broken pieces of different lives, fused together by loss and loyalty, now planting roots in the stubborn soil of a shared future. They had found their home not on a map, but in each other.